Yes, I do identify as European, and I have since I was an undergraduate, really. I mean, I also identify as British, but I do identify as European. Because to me, European values are Enlightenment values. They're universal values, but they're very strongly inculcated in Europe. So, freedom, democracy, reason, these are European values. They belong to everybody in the world, but I very much see myself as favouring those kind of values and felt very European. When I was around sort of 18, I felt very alienated from British society, and so I identified myself primarily as European. And that was especially when I went to live in Japan for a year. Between my third and fourth year undergraduate level, I was on an exchange program in Tokyo, and we had a course on ethnicity, and it prompted, one of the prompts was, it was about ethnicity in Japan, one of the prompts was, what's your ethnicity? And as a white person, I suppose in a majority white society, I'd never been prompted to ask that question before. And I came up with the argument that I am European. But a big part of that was my feeling of alienation from British society at that point in time. But living in Japan, which is a very alien culture, made me realise, yes, I am European, but also, for better or worse, I'm also very British. I think in the British context, at least, and I think this is probably also true of other European countries to a certain extent, identification with Europe, and especially identification with the European Union, is in part a reaction against a sense of national identification. It's almost in some cases a revulsion against the national. So people prefer to identify with something that's transnational. I think in the German context, for example, because of the history, the European Union is one of the ways that Germans feel they can rehabilitate themselves internationally. And they really don't like, obviously, the legacy of German nationalism and all the rest of it. That's also true of a lot of pro-Europeans or pro-EU people in the UK. I think there's a reaction against the national, and I can see that in my own biography. I became more reconciled to my actual Britishness, because you can't escape where you grew up, I think. You can't ever be truly transnational and a citizen of nowhere. I don't really believe that. I came to realise my own groundedness, that my own values, my own cultural patterns, sense of humour, all that were very much rooted in a particular place. And for better or worse, this is the place where it was. But I've never ceased to feel European. I also understand that I am also British, and there are worse things to be in the world. My feelings about Europe and feeling as a European was very much informed by my negative feelings about Britain at a particular point in time. And I can trace it to something very concrete, which was growing up as a gay man in the context of Britain in the 1990s, when there was still a lot of institutionalised, legalised homophobia. So I used to wake up every day to Radio 4 going off on my alarm clock, and the debate over the repeal of Section 28 of the Education Act, which forbade the discussion, the promotion of homosexuality in schools. So as a minority, I felt that this country was hostile to me. So I was hostile to it. So I was looking for some other way of identifying. And the next kind of layer, if you like, was Europe. So to me, a kind of a sense of a European identification was partly prompted by these questions about ethnicity in this class I was doing in Japan. But it was definitely prompted by a negative experience. It was not prompted by any particular event in Europe or an experience of even travelling in Europe. You know, I grew up in a working class household. We didn't have foreign holidays. My first foreign holiday was when I was 18. My parents took us to the Netherlands and to France. It was the first time I'd ever been abroad. The first time I got on a plane was to fly to Tokyo. when I was age 20. So, it wasn't through any kind of deep experience of Europe or anything like that. In terms of thinking about the EU, at school I had done a project on the euro and argued that it was pretty disastrous. It would be disastrous. So I was already then kind of a Eurosceptic, and we had a mock election at school, and I remember that at that time the Eurosceptic party was the referendum party. It was arguing that there should be a referendum on Britain's EU membership, and certainly there should be a referendum if we were to ever adopt the euro, because at that point in time that seemed like a real prospect that we might do it. And I was part of the mock election campaign for the referendum party. So I was Eurosceptic even then, as quite naive kid. I did not think the EU was that great, but I still identified as a European. I think there's a lot of competition for this, to be honest. But given where we are now with Brexit, my focus would be on the EU. So depends how far you want to go back, but the ignoring or overturning of the referenda around the Lisbon Treaty, everything that happened after the Eurozone crisis, the way the southern European economies were treated, the monetary and fiscal waterboarding of Greece, the installation of technocratic governments, places like Italy, and the hardening of the walls of Fortress Europe, the deals done with Turkey and Libyan militias and so on to try to keep migrants out of Europe. I think all of those they're terrible stains on the conscience of Europe, really. And if I wasn't already a Eurosceptic, which really was my academic studies that have made me a Eurosceptic, the ones I did as a graduate student. What? International relations. And there was a group of us working on questions of sovereignty. We had a group called Sovereignty and Its Discontents. And that's when I sort of started thinking seriously about questions of sovereignty and democracy and what was at stake in relinquishing sovereignty. Because initially I'd sort of grown out of my earlier Euroscepticism and become kind of a bit left liberal, thought European integration was kind of okay, wasn't it? When I started studying sovereignty and democracy more seriously, I reverted to my earlier Euroscepticism, or rather progressed in a different direction, I think. So I'd already taken a view against the EU, certainly by 2006, something like that. Certainly by then, long before the European Union referendum in 2016. If I wasn't already a Eurosceptic, I think those events would, and indeed did, make a lot of people Eurosceptic. That it punctured a lot of the myths about the European Union, that it was about solidarity and caring about each other and pooling our resources and being progressive in some way. I mean, I think the events, particularly since the Eurozone crisis, have just completely disproven that. On the question you ask about sovereignty, to me I realise that sovereignty is a political relationship between the state and its people, and it is mediated by democracy. And actually you need sovereignty to make democracy work. If the government is not only accountable to its people, but also to external forces, i.e. in the case of the EU, other member state governments and so on, then democracy is diluted. And so that's a position of adherence to popular sovereignty means rejecting sort of transnational constitutional forms like the European Union. I think Brexit is the best moment in recent European history because it is a blow for democracy. It's a blow for popular sovereignty and their European values. Obviously, I really am dissatisfied with the way that Brexit has gone. Right. So when I say Brexit, I don't mean the process. I mean the process has been completely shambolic. And a lot of what we've been doing with the full Brexit is to explain why it's so shambolic and how difficult it is to repair popular sovereignty after so many years of it being hollowed out. So I wouldn't want to defend the Leave campaign. I wouldn't want to defend the process of trying to negotiate an exit from the EU. I think it's all been highly shambolic. And I would be deeply, and I'm deeply critical of those things. But the fact that people were bold enough to say, we've actually had enough, and we want to restore popular sovereignty, accountability of our own government to us, and that people have, by and large, stayed true to the positions that they took in 2016. I think that's something to be celebrated, because the entire massed ranks of the establishment were telling them, don't do it. It'll be a complete disaster. You'll lose your house, you'll lose your job. There'll be a £36 billion punishment budget. There was an enormous amount of pressure. The IMF, President Obama, enormous amount of pressure on ordinary people to just cave and give their imprimatur to the EU, and they refused. And I think that gives me a lot of hope for the future. So I don't think that the EU's done anything particularly for me personally. I think on a professional level, it's definitely the case that British universities are enriched by the presence of many students and scholars from EU countries. And that is clearly a great benefit. I don't personally think we need the European Union to do that, because you can have a liberal visa regime that maintains that. And also it's the case that the visa system, by being very liberal and open to students and scholars from the EU, is indirectly discriminatory against people from outside of the European Union. So I've had colleagues, for example, that have lived in this country for quite a long time, and the immigration authorities eventually basically kicked them out. Or we've had a colleague here where, from North America, really struggled to get a visa. Now, those problems could be solved. I blame them on the EU. It's in the context of a country that is concerned about immigration, can't regulate the European side, bears down on the non-European side. So essentially you have a discriminatory migration regime. It's a long way around of saying that the main benefit that I feel in my everyday life is we do have lots of fellow Europeans in our institution, and I think that's a great thing. Whether you need a transnational neoliberal institution like the European Union to achieve that, I think is highly questionable. But I can't really think of any other single benefit that I would have directly had. It's not like I've received a research grant from the EU, or it allowed me to do X, Y, or Z that I couldn't have done otherwise. So I think that, for example, the Erasmus programme is a fantastic programme. And I studied abroad, although I studied in Japan, not in Europe. And I strongly recommend all students do some study abroad. I think it's fantastic. But of course, the Erasmus programme is not an EU programme, and nor is it limited to EU countries. So we can continue to participate in the Erasmus programme, and indeed we should. The suggestion that the UK government might not fund it, for example, and so on, is just ridiculous. It's just obscene, the idea that we wouldn't participate in those programmes. And I think it's really important for us to try to understand why freedom of movement has attained this sort of totemic status in the minds of people who support remaining in the European Union, why it's become so important. I think it's partly because people associate it with anti-racism. So the way that you prove that you're anti-racist today is that you support immigration, and immigration has become associated with freedom of movement. So that's the connection there. Of course, I'm anti-racist, and actually I'm in favour of a very liberal immigration regime, not one that's only limited to the EU. That's my personal preference. But I think that's an ideological connection that people make. But of course, freedom of movement in Europe is freedom of movement of workers as a factor of production. So it's one of the four freedoms alongside capital, goods and services. So it's not an unfettered right to move. It's a right of workers to move around Europe to sell their labour in different labour markets. That's what it actually is. And I don't think there's anything that progressive about liberalising the movement of factors of production. That's about market integration. That's essentially neoliberalism. And historically, it's a little bit, this attachment that people have is a little bit ignorant, I feel, as if nobody ever worked in Europe before the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, and now with the ending of freedom of movement, they never will. You know, that the Erasmus programme will end. We won't be able to have our foreign holidays. We won't be able to work overseas, and Europeans won't be able to work here. I mean, you know, people did work and move and travel overseas before the European Union, and they do it outside of the European Union. And as a sovereign country, you can have your own immigration regime. And I would argue to have it open equally on a non-discriminatory basis, so that there's no special privileging of EU nationals, which results in de facto discrimination against particularly non-white people, let's be honest. That's how it actually works out in practice. So it's a de facto racist immigration regime. So that's another reason why this connection to anti-racism is a peculiar one. So there's a lot of sort of ideological contortions around freedom of movement that I just don't share, despite the fact that I am committedly anti-racist and believe in a relatively liberal immigration regime. I think the way that people have latched on to what is essentially a labour market deregulation and think that that is somehow the height of progressive politics, I think is one of the more peculiar aspects of the Brexit crisis. The number of people who actually make use of it to work abroad and live abroad is really, really low, right? It's a vanishingly small percentage. I mean, in some countries it's high, right? So there's been an extensive depopulation of parts of Eastern Europe, such that they're now experiencing labour shortages. But the number of Brits that make use of it to go and work in Europe, for example, I mean, really small numbers of people. And let me say, my parents have retired to Spain. So, you know, I understand the point about retirement, but my parents are now going through a naturalisation process and, you know, to register and so on. In that community there, you're supposed to go to work. That's what freedom of movement of labour means. You're not supposed to just go there to just live. That's not how freedom of movement actually works. You're supposed to register and all the rest and this community has not been doing that. So now, because of what's happening with Brexit, they're sort of thinking, oh, well, we need to do this, this and this, which is quite interesting to me, that the Spanish authorities have been willing to tolerate this for such a long time because it has a beneficial impact on their economy. Anyway, I mean, this is completely beside the point. But it's not that I don't understand these concerns at all. You know, my own parents have retired to Spain. So, you know, and obviously they are very concerned about everything that's going on, and I'm concerned on their behalf. It's not that I'm ignorant of these issues at all. It's just that I think, A, we don't need the European Union to have visas to go and work or live in each other's countries. It's just not necessary. It can be arranged between sovereign countries. It already is. Lots of Australians come here. Lots of British people go and work in Canada. That can be done between sovereign nations. It doesn't require the European Union. And I don't think there's anything sort of progressive or, you know, anti-racist about freedom of movement, because as people like Guy Verhofstadt and so on have said, freedom of movement within Europe relies on protecting the borders of Europe from migrants trying to come in. So freedom of movement inside and bloody borders on the outside. Obviously, I would prefer the EU not to exist by 2030. I would just, you know, I'm not a nationalist. I don't believe that it's just about the UK and, you know, EU should continue. I believe all the nations of Europe should enjoy popular sovereignty and self-determination, and they should form a confederation that cooperate peaceably on the basis of democratic legitimation of those decisions. The problem with the European Union is not that it's some kind of secret superstate, you know, that's bearing down on all these countries and bossing them around. That's not how it works. It is a network of governance. It's about member states, representatives of member states in particular, forming a transnational executive which decides important policy matters behind closed doors. So public policy making shifts from the parliament, the public sphere in each national country, to the secret chambers of international diplomacy. That's the fundamental problem in the European Union. And that's not just a problem for the UK, it's a problem for every population in Europe. So that's why I'd like the European Union to be dismantled and replaced with, in my ideal world, a confederation of democratic socialist states that would work together, cooperate across borders and so on, but always on the basis of accountability to their own population. And public policy making would be done democratically, and there would be popular sovereignty. But that doesn't, to me, rule out future collaboration and working together. In fact, it requires it. And I'm not sure the EU will last to 2030, actually. I think, particularly the Eurozone, I think it is quite likely to be torn apart by its own internal contradictions. Certainly if there isn't fiscal consolidation and unification to match onto the monetary unification, I just don't see how the European Union can survive. And the reality is that the wealthier countries in the Eurozone, they can't afford the level of fiscal transfers that would be required to stabilise disparities in the EU, let alone narrow the disparities. Wolfgang Streeck, the German political economist, is very good on this. The prognosis, I think, is not very good. Well, let me be clear. The European Union will not metamorphosize into anything except a slightly tweaked version of itself. Right? I don't believe the European Union can be reformed. So people saying remain in reform, blah blah. I mean, no. Actually, the direction of travel, if there is a direction of travel, is towards greater integration. Partly because of the UK leaving. Actually, there's always been a bit of a fetter on French ambitions for a more integrated Europe, for example. But if that's the direction of travel, it's not towards restoring democratic control to member states. And even with the Brexit crisis and everything that's happened since 2008, you don't see significant reform proposals of the kind that I would like to see. And even if you had a socialist government in the UK, which was pushing for, the dismantling of neoliberalism in the European Union and real changes to the way the EU operated, it would be impossible to get that through the EU structures. You'd need consensus among all the member states. The likelihood of, socialist governments being elected simultaneously across 28 member countries it's completely implausible. So, and that's what would be required for major treaty reform. So the EU is not going to be reformed into something else. The EU has to be destroyed. It has to be dismantled, and then something else can be put in its place. I don't believe the EU can be transformed. So I would like the EU to be replaced with something else, rather than transform into something else. Sorry. No, the replacement to the EU would be a confederation of democratic states cooperating with each other, but always those states fully accountable to their own populations and not limited by what is in effect a neoliberal constitution for the whole of Europe. That's the thing that has to be removed, I think. And then we can work peacefully and cooperatively together. Well, plenty of small countries do fend for themselves. I mean, this idea that the EU needs to become an empire, as Guy Verhofstadt puts it, in order to be a bloc that competes with the United States and Russia and China and so on, I think that's deeply disturbing. It's not a new idea. It was actually circulating in the middle of the last decade. I remember Barroso saying at one point that we have a dimension of empire. And the idea that the only way that Europe was going to sort of punch at its weight in the world was by unifying and being this bloc, this counterweight. I think it's never actually going to happen. It's just a federalist dream. I think actually there's not that much appetite for more federal integration, particularly in the sphere of foreign and security policy. It's never really got very far. But also, what we're talking about here, we're talking about creating a a militaristic bloc in Europe that is going to engage in 19th century style balance of power politics against other major powers. Is that what we want? Is that the image that we have of Europe? It's supposed to be a peace project, right? But actually we're talking about getting an EU army so that we can compete with other major powers. Why do you want to say in world affairs? Why can't you just have a say in your own affairs? You know, I said I want the European Union to be replaced by something else. We started by talking about whether the European Union should gear up to compete against other major powers, and my argument was against that. And what we're talking about there is about military power, becoming an empire, all that kind of federalist stuff that people like Guy Verhofstadt have been pushing, and appear to be increasingly on the agenda in terms of building an EU army. You know, the new Commission chief is very in favour of it and this kind of thing. Whether it will ever happen, I mean, I'm kind of sceptical, but that kind of thing I'm totally opposed to. I don't think we need another military bloc in the world to engage in 19th century style balance of power politics. I'm totally opposed to it. And when I say, why can't you just sort out your own area, what I mean by that is military power in the West over the last, God knows how long, has been used to intervene in other societies with often disastrous consequences. And I think a policy of general non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs would actually serve the cause of world peace a lot better. And you don't have to look very far to see what that means. Look at Ukraine, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Libya. I mean, all around the borders of Europe, you've got the legacy of NATO and American, UK intervention. I don't want to see the EU developing its own intervention forces so that it can rampage around the world just like the Americans do. I think that's a terrible model to pursue. Now, does that mean that European countries should not, where they have democratic sanction and it's in line with what ordinary people want and it reflects shared values and interests, should they not cooperate and try to encourage others in the world to cooperate? Of course they should. Of course they should. Do we need the neoliberal institutions of the European Union to produce that kind of cooperation? I don't think so. So I'm all for international cooperation. It's absolutely essential. There are many shared problems in the world that we have to work towards. But the idea that the European Union is the be-all and end-all of international cooperation, I think, is just wrong. And it's become so delinked as a form of political cooperation from everyday politics, from popular sovereignty and democracy. It's not sustainable. That kind of elitist, liberal managerialist approach to international cooperation, because it's not grounded in continual bargaining, negotiation, persuasion, democratic sanction at the domestic level, it's a very brittle form of cooperation. It can be very easily revolted against because people don't experience it as belonging to them. And that's not sustainable in the long term. If people feel like they're being done to, they're being acted upon, that they're subjects, not citizens, then they don't want to participate in this. Look at France. It's a classic case in point. Connects to your question about climate change. What was the trigger for the Gilets jaunes revolts in France? EU green taxes, which the relatively poor people in peri-urban areas and in small towns and so on, who are really struggling after years of austerity, which is linked to the Eurozone's economic policies. For this, that was the last straw. And so they've been protesting consistently. And what's the French government doing? Have some fake, national conversation, a bit more infrastructure spending, and then use incredible amounts of police brutality to try to suppress these people. Is that the future of Europe that you want? It's not the future of Europe that I want. I want us to be democratic and cooperative, but one cannot come at the expense of the other. I'm familiar with that whole debate from the mid-2000s, and people like Jan Zelonka at Oxford, for example, were writing about Europe as an empire, and what they meant was they were talking about so-called civilian power, so that it wasn't about arms, it was the force of persuasion, it was about technical cooperation, it was about the accession process, it was sort of this kind of creeping empire of laws, if you like, and norms, and all this good stuff. So the form of empire, and then it's transnational, and it spreads, and it sort of civilises the people that it touches. That's the kind of thing that Barroso's talking about, not sort of, marching troops into another people's country and sticking down the EU flag and so on. Of course, the EU does not tend to do that. You take Ukraine, for example, there's a very good case that you can make that NATO and the EU created the crisis in Ukraine. And especially in the EU's case, it's not because some set of bureaucrats or political elites sitting in Brussels, plan to extend the EU empire into Ukraine. There was never any sort of consciousness. The consciousness is closer to what Barroso is telling you, that we're going there and we offer you a enhanced, neighbourhood partnership and this trade deal, and once you do those reforms, and it would involve this, this, and this. And what you're doing is blundering into what is effectively a geopolitical conflict. You think you're just doing capacity building and trade negotiations. So for the Portuguese elite, I'm not saying all Portuguese elite, but for the pro-EU bit of the elite, it's a wonderful thing to be a member of the European Union, because and this is no disrespect to Portugal, this peripheral state on the edge of Europe, which is relatively poor and underdeveloped by the standards of the core, gets to stand on the stage of Europe with the big boys. The Prime Minister of Portugal is as entitled to be the rotating president of the EU as the Chancellor of Germany. The Taoiseach of Ireland, a country of just a handful of a few million people, gets to stand on the same level as the Prime Minister of Britain. Tiny countries like Luxembourg and so on, they're suddenly propelled into this position of apparently immense power through their formal political equality with other heads of government. So, I don't really want to get into the details of Portugal's response to the Eurozone crisis, which I think has been interesting. Of course, Portugal is held up as the poster boy of, they did the reforms. So, yeah, they're the good boys. We pat them on the head and praise them, and it just shows you what the Greeks could have done if they just behaved themselves. I think the true story is rather different. But it's what I'm saying here is not that the EU has been an unmitigated disaster from start to finish. I'm not saying that at all, or that individuals have not benefited from European integration. The only way that you can understand the way that different countries think and feel about the European Union is to understand their own specific trajectory, how they came to Europe, what Europe means to them as a result of that political and historical development. And obviously, for post-fascist states like Portugal, Europe means modernity, it means democracy, it means escape from fascism. So, of course, and this is also this case in Greece with the colonels, that's how they escape from that. It's the same for Germany, in a sense. That was how they rehabilitated themselves after the Second World War. And that is not the case with the UK, for example. So, of course, different countries understand what European integration means in relation to their own society's evolution. And that actually speaks to the continued fragmentation of Europe as a polity. It's not a single polity. It's composed of national polities, where people still understand what European integration means and what the EU means as a result of their own society's distinctive historical process. And that is precisely why it would be very difficult for Portugal or Greece or Spain, for example, to leave the European Union, because it means something different to you guys than it means to us. And in the final analysis, if you look at Greece, for example, it's impossible to understand why the Greek political class decided against, when they could have led the Greek people out of Europe, they could have done that. They could have easily formed a majority for it by saying, okay, it's the only way actually to restore economic growth is to pull out of the euro, and there'll be a few hard years, but actually what's happening inside the euro cannot work. But why didn't they do it when they had the opportunity to do it? The terrible treatment that they suffered, the way that they had to become conduits for a really brutal form of austerity that has led to mass suicides, the hollowing out of the health service, and so on. I mean, it's just appalling. Why did they do it? You can't understand it absent their trajectory. After military rule, they escape into Europe, the realm of modernity and democracy, and the terror that leaving the European Union means going back to fascism. You can't understand it without that. And so it will be very difficult for those countries ever to leave the European Union until they're bold enough to say it doesn't mean going back to fascism. Restoring national self-determination and sovereignty does not mean going back to fascism.